Hey everyone! Ready for a deep dive into a word you probably use all the time but haven't really thought about? We're tackling Caucasian today, and let me tell you, its backstory is a wild one. We found this YouTube discussion where these two guys are going back and forth about a lecture on the term, and, well, let's just say things get pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's amazing how a word that seems so simple can have such complex and honestly outdated roots.
For real. So, picture this. It's the 18th century, and you're chilling with Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, this German scientist who was really into skulls. He decided there were five human races based on skull shapes, and get this. He called white people Caucasian because he thought a skull from the Caucasus Mountains was like the most beautiful skull he'd ever seen.
And it does sound kind of crazy now, but back then people thought studying skulls was like cutting-edge science. And as with a lot of science from that era, Blumenbach's ideas were, shaped by the social prejudices of his time.
Yeah.
Sadly, his work ended up feeding into this whole idea of a racial hierarchy.
And get this, the skull that Blumenbach was so obsessed with was from a young Georgian woman who, according to the lecture, died from venereal disease. Talk about a weird historical footnote.
It really shows how even scientific discoveries can be totally influenced by cultural contexts and subjective interpretations. What might seem objective in one era can be seen as completely off base later on.
Right, right. Okay, but Blumenbach wasn't the only scientist doing this kind of thing, was he? Wasn't there also Carl Linnaeus? He had those categories like Americanas, Asiaticas, Africanas, and Europea. Not quite as catchy as Caucasian, though.
True, but both Linnaeus and Blumenbach's work kind of fed into those rigid racial classifications that became even more ingrained in the 19th and 20th centuries. And tragically, these classifications were used to justify horrible things like colonialism and slavery.
It's crazy to think about that. And thankfully, as our YouTube commentators pointed out, modern science has totally debunked these early ideas about like distinct biologically defined races.
Right, absolutely.
We know now that race is a social construct, not a biological fact.
Exactly. This whole idea of race as this fixed biological thing just doesn't hold up scientifically.
Okay, so we've established that Caucasian has, shall we say, some problematic roots. But what about the actual Caucasus region and the people who live there? What's that place actually like?
Well, the Caucasus Mountains are a fascinating region. They're nestled between Black and Caspian Seas,
Yeah.
and they stretch across Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Russia, Turkey, and Iran. So it's a real mix of cultures and people.
Yeah, the video we're looking at actually pointed out that a lot of people from the Caucasus wouldn't really fit that typical American image of what Caucasian means. There's even a clip with a Black American guy living in Moscow, and he's talking about how differently the term is understood in Russia. It really shows you how much the meaning of a word can change depending on, where you are.
Absolutely. The same word can carry completely different weight and social implications, all depending on the cultural context.
Now, one of the YouTube commentators actually said he prefers Caucasian to white because it sounds, and I quote, cooler. He made this funny comparison about how Caucasian makes him think of, like, a skydiver, while white makes him think of an accountant.
Huh.
It's funny, but it made me think about how attached we can get to certain words, even if they have, a messy history.
It does make you think, doesn't it? I mean, while he might find the term more appealing, using Caucasian as a synonym for white kind of risks perpetuating a false historical narrative, don't you think? It's basically taking a geographical and cultural identity and slapping it onto a racial category, which can obscure the real experiences of people from the Caucasus.
Yeah, that's a good point. It gets even more complex when you factor in this other thing the commentator said about how Black people are inherently more moral than white people.
Yeah, that statement, while probably meant to get a reaction, really brings up some thorny issues. It gets into how personal biases and cultural differences can shape our ideas about what's right and wrong. But let's be clear, morality isn't tied to a person's race. It's way more complicated than that.
Totally. Speaking of complicated, can we go back to the idea of race as a social construct for a minute? Could you maybe break that down for our listeners in a way that's, clear and concise?
Sure. So the idea that distinct races actually exist as like biological realities is fundamentally flawed. There's just no solid genetic basis for racial categories. When you analyze the human genome, the variations we see within what we call racial groups are actually greater than the variations between those groups.
So scientifically speaking, there's no such thing as a white gene or a Black gene.
Exactly. What we see as racial differences
Mm-hmm.
are mostly superficial variations influenced by things like geographic ancestry. and the expression of certain genes that are related to, skin color or hair texture. But these traits don't line up neatly with the rigid racial categories we've created.
So if you were looking at humans through a purely biological lens, there's really only one race.
Precisely. And a great way to understand this is through the biological concept of a species. A species is defined as a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring.
So meaning their kids can have kids too.
Yes. And since humans from all backgrounds can interbreed and have children who can then have their own children, we are by definition one species. There are no biological barriers to reproduction between what we call races, which further proves that these distinctions are social, not biological.
Whoa, that really puts things in perspective. So those old school racial classification systems we talked about earlier, those are totally missing the mark.
Absolutely. Modern science recognizes that human genetic diversity is mainly a result of migration, interbreeding, and cultural exchange that's been happening over thousands of years. These processes have created this rich tapestry of human variation, which makes those simplistic racial classifications not only inaccurate, but also deeply misleading.
Okay, so now that we've debunked the biological basis of race, what does all of that mean for our understanding of the term Caucasian?
It means this seemingly simple word carries a lot of baggage. Baggage rooted in outdated science, historical prejudices, and social constructs that still shape how we think about race and identity.
So we really need to be more mindful of the language we use when we're discussing race and ethnicity.
For sure. Language has power. Using terms like Caucasian without understanding their historical context and potential for harm can actually reinforce harmful stereotypes and contribute to the very racial hierarchies we should be trying to dismantle.
So to sum it all up, the term Caucasian really shows us how a seemingly straightforward word can have a surprisingly complicated and problematic history.
It really does. And as we've seen, exploring the origin and evolution of these kinds of terms can reveal deeper truths about science, society, and the power of language to, shape our understanding of the world.
And that's what makes these deep dives so interesting. But we're just getting started. We've got even more insights to uncover in part 2 of our exploration of Caucasian. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Caucasian. Before we move on, I think it's worth, circling back to Johann Friedrich Blumenbach for a sec. We've talked about his skull obsession and his flawed racial classifications, but he actually did make some significant contributions to science beyond that.
Oh, really? I have to admit, I'm still picturing him surrounded by skulls in a dimly lit lab, just muttering about beauty and bone structure. So what else was he up to?
Well, you're not totally wrong about the skull part, but Blumenbach was also a pioneer in the field of comparative anatomy. He was super fascinated by the variations he saw in human anatomy, and he believed that studying these differences could, shed light on human origins in the natural world.
So he wasn't just a skull guy after all.
Not at all. Yeah. And while his racial classifications were definitely problematic, I think we have to remember that he was a product of his time, and his research did help pave the way for modern anthropology and our understanding of human evolution.
That's a good point. It's a good reminder that science is, constantly evolving. What might have been considered groundbreaking in one era can be completely debunked or reinterpreted later on as new evidence emerges. And speaking of reinterpretation, our YouTube commentators had some pretty strong opinions about Blumenbach's ideas.
Yeah, they did. And their critiques highlight how important it is to, approach historical figures and their theories with a critical eye. We have to acknowledge both their contributions and their limitations, especially when those limitations have had, harmful consequences.
One of the commentators brought up a point about the biblical story of Noah's Ark. Blumenbach believed that the Caucasus region was the cradle of humanity because it was near Mount Ararat, which is where Noah's Ark supposedly landed. It's interesting how religious beliefs can sometimes get all mixed up with scientific theories, especially back then when scientific understanding was still, developing.
Totally. It shows how different ways of understanding the world can, influence each other.
Yeah.
Sometimes in ways that we might find surprising or even contradictory today.
And it also shows how these discussions about race, science, and history, they aren't just abstract academic debates. They're connected to people's personal beliefs and how they see the world.
Exactly. These conversations have real-world implications, and they can get, pretty heated, like we saw in that YouTube discussion. At one point, they were arguing about whether environmental factors can actually influence physical differences between people. One of them was arguing that things like nutrition and access to education can affect things like height and intelligence.
That's interesting. I've always wondered how much of who we are is, like, determined by our genes and how much is shaped by our environment.
It's definitely a complex interplay, and scientists are
Mhm.
still trying to figure out all the factors involved. While environmental factors definitely play a role in individual development, they don't change the underlying genetic makeup that's passed down from one generation to the next.
So, like, a child who grows up in a really nurturing and stimulating environment might have a better chance of reaching their full potential, but they won't inherit those environmental advantages directly.
Right. That's where genetics comes in. The genes we inherit from our parents determine our, predisposition for certain traits. But the environment can influence how those traits are expressed, or whether they're even expressed at all.
It's like that classic nature versus nurture debate.
Exactly. It's a combo of both. And the specific ways they interact can be super intricate.
Okay, so back to Blumenbach and his racial categories for a sec. We've talked about Caucasian, but he also used terms like Mongolian. What was he even referring to with that one?
So Blumenbach used Mongolian to describe what he considered the yellow race, which was basically his way of categorizing people from East Asia, Central Asia, and parts of Southeast Asia.
Hmm.
His classification was based on like the geographic distribution of people in those regions, and it was probably influenced by the historical expansion of Mongol tribes across Asia.
So he was trying to connect physical features, geography, and even historical events to create these racial categories. It seems like he was trying to impose order on a world that's, inherently diverse and complex.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's the fundamental problem with trying to create these neat and tidy categories for human diversity. They're often arbitrary, based on subjective perceptions and limited scientific understanding.
And did he use the same approach for his other categories? Like Malayan? I'm guessing that one refers to people from Malaysia.
You got it. The Malayan category included what Blumenbach saw as the brown race, which was mainly located in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. It included all sorts of diverse groups of people living in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Polynesia.
It's crazy how some of these terms, like Mongolian and Malayan, are still sometimes used today, even though we know they're based on, bad science and outdated ideas about race.
It's a reminder of how language can have a real staying power,
Mm.
even when the ideas behind the words have been totally discredited. These terms become embedded in our vocabulary and our cultural understanding. And it takes a conscious effort to challenge them and think about like the implications of using them.
Makes you wonder how many other words we use without realizing they have, problematic origins,
Yeah.
or that they might be perpetuating harmful stereotypes.
That's a great question. Language is constantly evolving, and it's so important to be aware of the historical and social context of the words we use.
Okay, so Blumenbach also had a category he called Ethiopian. I have a feeling this one's going to be particularly problematic.
Yeah, you're right. Blumenbach used Ethiopian to refer to what he called the black race, mainly located in sub-Saharan Africa. And the origin of that term is really troubling. It comes from the ancient Greek words atho, meaning burnt, and ops, meaning face.
Burnt face? That's just awful. This is such a blatant example of dehumanizing language and the prejudice that associates dark skin with something negative.
It is. It reflects this long history of racist ideology that's been used to, justify discrimination and oppression. It's a stark reminder of how language can be used to otherize and devalue entire groups of people.
It's disheartening to think about how these terms, like Ethiopian, have been used to basically strip people of their individuality and reduce them to a single, simple category.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember that behind those labels are real people with their own unique histories, cultures, and lived experiences. Reducing them to these simplistic racial categories just ignores their richness and complexity.
And finally, we have Blumenbach's category for American. I'm assuming he wasn't talking about, folks having barbecues on the 4th of July.
Nope. He was referring to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the original inhabitants of North and South America. His classification included a huge range of diverse tribes, including, the Cherokee, Navajo, and countless others.
So even in the Americas, where there wasn't like a long history of European colonialism at the time,
Right.
he was still imposing these racial categories based on perceived physical differences and geographic location.
It was, which shows just how pervasive these classificatory impulses were. There was this real urge to categorize and order the world, even if it meant ignoring all the nuances of human diversity and the unique experiences of different cultures.
Well, it seems Blumenbach wasn't alone in his quest to create these human classifications. The commentators in the video also mentioned Carl Linnaeus, who we talked about a little bit earlier. Didn't he
Yeah.
come up with his own system too?
He did. Carl Linnaeus was a Swedish botanist, physician, and zoologist. He's considered the father of taxonomy. He's famous for developing this hierarchical system for classifying all living things, including humans.
So he was like the ultimate organizer of the natural world.
You could say that. He was really meticulous in his classifications. And while his system was revolutionary for its time, it also, reflected the limited scientific understanding of the 18th century.
And how did his human classifications compare to Blumenbach's? Were they like similar at all?
They were similar in that they both relied on this idea that there were, distinct and biologically defined races. Linnaeus divided humans into four categories: Americanus, Asiaticus, Africanus, and Europeldis. Like Blumenbach's system, his categories were based on this combo of physical traits, geographic location, and even perceived behavioral characteristics.
So both systems, even though they had their differences, were ultimately based on this flawed idea that there are these like distinct biological races.
Exactly. And unfortunately, these ideas contributed to what became known as scientific racism in the 19th and 20th centuries. That was a period when, scientists tried to use flawed data and biased methodologies to justify racial hierarchies and discrimination.
It's crazy how scientific pursuits, which are supposed to be objective, can be like twisted to serve these harmful ideologies.
It really is. It's a cautionary tale about how important critical thinking and ethical considerations are. And recognizing the potential for bias in, all scientific endeavors. We can't just blindly accept scientific findings without questioning the assumptions behind them and the potential consequences of those findings.
And luckily, as those YouTube commentators pointed out, modern science has, thoroughly debunked these racist theories.
Right, absolutely. The scientific community now pretty much universally recognizes that race is a social construct, not a biological reality. The whole idea that there are these, significant genetic differences between what we call races has been completely discredited.
So, just to be super clear, there's no scientific basis for claiming that one race is, inherently superior to another.
None whatsoever. Those claims are totally rooted in prejudice and ignorance, not scientific evidence.
The commentators mentioned that this whole idea of race as a social construct has been recognized for, a while now. Was there, a particular turning point when this shift in scientific understanding occurred?
It wasn't so much a sudden shift as a gradual accumulation of evidence and changing perspectives. The horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, which were fueled by these racist ideologies, definitely played a big role in forcing people to, really reckon with the dangers of racial classifications.
So it took the world witnessing the devastating consequences of racism before those harmful scientific myths were fully dismantled.
Sadly, yeah, that's often how progress happens. But in the decades after World War II, several factors contributed to this wider acceptance of race as a social construct. The civil rights movement challenged racial segregation and discrimination. Advancements in genetics provided further evidence against biological race, and growing awareness of cultural diversity helped people understand the vast spectrum of human experience beyond these, simplistic racial categories.
So it was a combo of scientific progress and social activism that helped overturn these harmful beliefs.
Exactly. It shows how science and society are interconnected, and how social movements can actually drive scientific inquiry and challenge established paradigms. Sometimes it takes pressure from outside the scientific community to force a reevaluation of long-held assumptions.
It's a powerful reminder that science isn't done in a vacuum. It's influenced by the social and political context in which it operates. What questions are being asked, what research is being funded, and how scientific findings are interpreted can all be influenced by the, prevailing social and political climate.
Absolutely. Recognizing that is essential for understanding how scientific knowledge is produced, interpreted, and ultimately used, both for good and for bad. We have to be aware of the potential for bias and the ways in which scientific findings can be misused to justify inequality and discrimination.
Well, it's been quite a journey so far, unpacking the origins of Caucasian and this complex history of racial classification. We've gone from 18th century skull measurements to the mapping of the human genome. What's next on our deep dive?
In the final part of our exploration, we're going to delve into the modern understanding of race as a social construct and explore some of the broader implications for how we think about identity and diversity in an increasingly interconnected world. Stay tuned for part 3.
Welcome back to part 3. So we've spent the last couple of parts, really digging into the history of this word Caucasian. We've looked at those 18th century scientists, debated with some YouTube commentators, and kind of explored how our whole understanding of race has changed over time. But now I'm wondering, where does all this leave us? What does it actually mean to say that race is a social construct? And how does that, affect our lives today?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that a lot of researchers and social scientists are still trying to figure out. I think the main takeaway is that while race might not be biologically real, it has very real social consequences.
Okay, I get that. I mean, I understand that race isn't about actual biological differences, but how can something that isn't, real have such a huge impact on people's
Well,
lives?
think of it this way. We, as a society, have created these categories,
Yeah.
right? And we've given those categories meaning. Over, centuries, those categories have become all tangled up with power structures and social hierarchies. They've been used to justify discrimination, oppression, and inequality.
So even though there's no scientific basis for saying one race is, better than another, the idea of race has been used to create advantages for some groups while disadvantaging others.
Exactly. And those advantages and disadvantages,
Mm.
they kind of accumulate over time,
Yeah.
impacting everything from, access to education and healthcare to economic opportunities and representation in government.
One of those commentators in the YouTube discussion we've been talking about, he made this interesting point. He said he thinks that in 1,000 years, the concept of race will basically disappear because people will have intermarried so much that these categories won't, mean anything anymore. It's kind of a hopeful idea, but is it realistic?
It's an interesting thought experiment for sure. As globalization and migration continue to connect people from different backgrounds, those rigid racial boundaries we've created, those might start to blur a bit. But I think it's important to remember that simply mixing populations won't just magically erase the social structures and historical legacies that have shaped these racial disparities.
So even if those categories become less, defined, the inequalities that go along with them, those might still stick around.
That's a real possibility, yeah. Dismantling those inequalities requires more than just demographic shifts. It means actively challenging racist policies and practices, addressing systemic bias, and really promoting equity and inclusion in every part of society.
I remember learning about institutional racism in college, but it always felt kind of like this abstract concept. Do you have any real world examples of what that actually looks like in practice?
Oh, tons. Think about the history of housing discrimination in the U.S. For decades, people of color were straight up denied access to homeownership through stuff like redlining. That's where banks would just refuse to give loans to people in certain neighborhoods based on their race. That created a wealth gap that still affects, generations of families today.
So even though those discriminatory housing policies aren't in place anymore, their effects are still being felt because they stop people of color from building wealth through homeownership.
Exactly. And that's just one example, really. Institutional racism shows up in so many ways, from disparities in healthcare and education to the criminal justice system and, hiring practices.
That reminds me of white privilege, which is a term that often, causes a lot of debate. What does it actually mean to say that white people have privilege in a society where, race is a social construct?
Well, white privilege doesn't mean that white people haven't had their own challenges or hardships,
Yeah.
right? It just acknowledges that in a society that's built around these racial categories, white people are less likely to face certain disadvantages or obstacles just because of their race.
So, for example, a white person applying for a job, they might not even have to think about their race being a factor in whether they get hired or not. Whereas a person of color might face, unconscious bias or even straight up discrimination.
Exactly. Or think about just, walking down the street. A white person is less likely to get stopped by police or followed around by security guards in a store just because of how they look. These might seem like small things, but they add up over time. And they contribute to a sense of safety and security that a lot of people of color don't have.
So recognizing white privilege is important for understanding how racial inequality works on this systemic level. It's not about, blaming white people. It's about acknowledging these unearned advantages that are just baked into the system.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Recognizing those advantages is
Yeah.
the first step towards building a more just and equitable society, a place where everyone has a real chance to succeed, no matter their race or ethnicity.
This whole deep dive has been a wild ride. We've learned a lot about where this term Caucasian comes from, the bad science behind racial categories. and all the ways that race is still shaping our lives today.
It's been awesome exploring this stuff with you. I hope it's given our listeners, a better understanding of how complex race really is, and maybe encourage them to think critically about their own assumptions and the language they use.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground, but what would you say to our listeners who are feeling like overwhelmed by all this info? They're wondering what they can even do to make a difference.
First, I'd say don't underestimate the power of just like being informed and aware, knowing the history, understanding the science,
Hmm.
and recognizing how racism shows up in our society. That's the most important first step.
So learning and listening, that's a good place to start.
Absolutely. And then there are tons of ways to get involved. You can challenge racist language and behavior when you see it, support organizations that are working for racial justice, and advocate for policies that, promote equity and inclusion. Even small actions can make a big difference.
So creating a more just and equal world, it's a team effort, something we're all responsible for.
Exactly. It's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about being willing to learn, grow, and work together
Hmm.
to take apart those systems of oppression that have held so many people back for way too long.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the surprising origin of Caucasian. We hope you found it, interesting and thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit challenging.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for a more just and equitable world.